It was just past midnight when the kitchen lights dimmed to their resting glow, and the scent of garlic and grease still hung thick in the air. The clatter of dishes had ceased, the last waitress had clocked out, and the cooks were long gone. But in the shadows, a figure moved silently, nimble hands slicing scallions, with the kind of grace born from obsession, not training. Tobias stood over a stovetop brow, furrowed in focus, coaxing life into a pan of eggs and butter. The sizzle was like music. He didn't have a place to sleep tonight. Not a bed, not even a couch. But for these few minutes, the kitchen was his sanctuary. The loud stomp of boots shattered the calm. The restaurant's night guard stormed in, flashlight beams slicing through the dim. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Tobias froze, spatula midair. "I was just cooking. I'll clean everything, I swear." Before he could finish, a large hand grabbed his arm and yanked him away from the stove. The eggs slid forgotten off the burner. Another man appeared. Mr. Whitaker, the general manager, still in his evening suit, his tie loose and expression tight with disgust. "You again," Whitaker growled, eyes narrowing as he recognized the young man. "I told you last time. You don't belong here." Tobias didn't flinch. His shirt was stained, his sneakers worn to the sole, and the chill of the autumn air clung to his skin. But his voice, though quiet, held a quiet fire. "I just wanted to cook something right. Just once." Whitaker snorted. "You, a homeless kid who got kicked out of culinary school. What you think you're going to be the next Gordon Ramsay?" The security guard laughed. Whitaker stepped closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Ke vo gia kunhu mai ma kung mon lam jao bepa. Go sleep in your car, street boy. The kitchen's for professionals." Tobias stared at him, calm and still. He said nothing for a beat. Then he smiled, not with arrogance but certainty. One day he said softly, "You'll eat in my restaurant, and I'll cook for you, and you won't even know it." They threw him out just like they had a dozen times before. Cut to 3 years later. The restaurant was glowing, warm lights, polished glass, soft jazz humming through the air. A valet opened the door for Whitaker, who walked in with his wife dressed in a crisp navy blazer. The place was buzzing. Waiters in pressed uniforms, dishes that looked like they belonged in a gallery, and patrons that whispered excitedly over each plate. On the wall, in bold brass letters, "Urban Flame." Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "New spot, huh?" The hostess greeted them with a smile and led them to a corner table. "Tonight's tasting menu features our chef's signature truffle cream eggs over smoked sweet corn hash," she explained. "It's a tribute to his roots." The plate arrived. Whitaker picked up his fork, unimpressed, until the first bite. He blinked. "Damn," he muttered. "This is incredible." His wife nodded. "What was the chef's name again?" The hostess leaned in, smiling. "Tobias Grant, Atlanta-born, used to cook on a food truck, now one of the youngest chefs invited to American Culinary Showdown." Whitaker choked mid-bite. Across the room behind the kitchen's viewing window, Tobias stood in his chef's whites. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched. And for a moment, Whitaker's eyes met his and lingered. Recognition dawned heavy and uncomfortable. But Tobias turned away. And that's where the story truly begins, not with applause, not with fame, but with a 22-year-old sleeping in his car stomach, empty, and dreams even hungrier. Before the restaurant, before the lights and the cameras, before anyone believed in him, he had to lose everything. His pride, his school, his sense of belonging. What drives someone like Tobias to rise from a cracked leather back seat to the cover of culinary magazines? How does a man who was once called trash become a symbol of hope with nothing but a spatula and sheer will? That story begins the night he was expelled from culinary school, and it only gets messier from there. Before the white jackets and plated art, there was heat. Not the kind from a commercial stove or a food critic's spotlight, but the kind that clings to Georgia summers and swelters inside the broken-down apartments of South Atlanta. That's where Tobias Grant's story really started. He grew up in a one-bedroom unit at the edge of Carver Homes, a neighborhood where busted hydrants doubled as playgrounds and cracked sidewalks were more common than green lawns. His mother, Lorraine, was a nurse assistant who worked nights and prayed mornings. There was no father in the picture, just Tobias, his mom, and a persistent smell of grease from the downstairs fried chicken joint. They didn't have much, but what they did have was the church. Every Sunday while the choir rehearsed and the pastor fine-tuned his sermon, Tobias was in the church kitchen. Sister Mattie would hand him a peeling knife and nod toward a bucket of sweet potatoes. He was 8 the first time he chopped without supervision, 10 when he started seasoning the collard greens. By 12, he was begging to flip catfish in the fryer. No one taught him with textbooks or theory. He learned through rhythm, through instinct, through burn marks and second tries. He didn't say it out loud back then, but Tobias loved it. The sizzling, the aroma, the hush that fell over a room when food was finally served, it gave him a kind of peace nothing else did. So when he got a scholarship to the prestigious Edison Culinary Institute in New York, people in the neighborhood threw a fundraiser to buy him a suitcase. Pastor Rowland even gave him his old chef's knife, the blade wrapped in a dish towel, like it was sacred. And for a while, it felt like everything was finally turning. Edison was another world, gleaming kitchens, students who summered in France, professors who wrote books on flavor theory. Tobias arrived with a duffel bag, a southern drawl, and a fire in his chest. But it didn't take long for that fire to get him in trouble. He wasn't like the others. He didn't bow his head and say, "Yes, chef," when someone questioned his methods. He cooked with soul, not spreadsheets. And he didn't take kindly to condescension, especially not from instructors who smirked when he said he'd grown up cooking catfish and turnip greens. By his third semester, the tension had boiled over. One afternoon, after an argument with a chef who'd insulted his plating, Tobias threw down his towel and walked out of class. That night, he got the email expulsion. No warning, no second chance. Just like that, his shot was over. With nowhere to go, he packed his things and took a Greyhound back to Atlanta. Lorraine's old Toyota Corolla had long stopped running, but the back seat was still intact. That's where he slept, curled up in that car parked in the church lot, where he'd once helped slice onions. He applied to every kitchen he could find. Diners, gas station grills, mall food courts. No one wanted to hire a dropout with an attitude and no formal references. But Tobias didn't give up. Not when it rained, not when he went days without a real meal. He carried his knife in his backpack like a keepsake, like a lifeline. Because if there was one thing he still had, it was the hunger to cook. Eventually, he found himself standing outside a faded roadside diner called Lawson's Table. The sign buzzed dimly. It was the kind of place most people passed without a glance. But the smell, that smell of smoked sausage and fried cabbage, was impossible to ignore. He asked to see the manager. Mr. Lawson, a thick-set man with kind eyes and sleeves rolled to the elbow, looked him up and down. "You got any experience?" "Yes, sir. Church kitchens and culinary school. Kind of dropped out." "Can you wash dishes?" "Yes, sir. Can you show up on time? I live out back," Tobias said, half joking, half ashamed. Lawson stared at him a long second, then handed him an apron. "You wash dishes first. You were in the line later. But don't screw around in my kitchen." Tobias nodded, biting back tears. He didn't know it then, but Mr. Lawson wasn't just offering him a job. He was offering him something far rarer, a second beginning. It started small, like most things that matter. A single dish returned untouched, a sideways glance, a whispered laugh. Tobias, now wearing an old borrowed apron, and a smile that hid more than it showed, washed dishes in the back of Lawson's Table for the first 3 weeks without ever touching a stove. He scrubbed plates until his knuckles cracked, took out trash, mopped grease off the floor at midnight. He didn't complain, not once, because in the quiet moments when the last order had gone out and the line cook slipped out for cigarettes, Mr. Lawson would let him stay. And in those sacred 30 minutes, Tobias cooked. He worked in silence, using scraps others would have tossed, wilted herbs, ends of garlic cloves, bruised tomatoes. He didn't see garbage. He saw opportunity. Each night he refined his timing, tested new techniques, taught himself what Edison never had the patience to explain. In those hours, the kitchen was his again. But when the door swung open the next day, it was a different reality. He had earned a spot at the prep station barely, and even then he wasn't allowed to plate anything. The other cooks, seasoned and territorial, didn't hide their disdain. "You sure you're not just the janitor?" one sneered when Tobias prepped a tray of herbs. Another muttered under his breath, "Can't believe Lawson's letting this charity case in the line." Tobias ignored them, mostly. But it stung, especially when customers asked to have their meals remade if they caught sight of him in the kitchen. Once a man sent back his fried catfish after seeing Tobias walk past the dining room, claiming it was undercooked. It hadn't even been Tobias's dish. He started sleeping less and working more. There was no clock in time when you had no home, no distractions when your dreams were your only company. Late at night, long after the sign outside had gone dark, Tobias would reheat pans and practice. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to feel, if only for an hour, that he was good at something again. Then came a Tuesday that would change everything. The lunch rush had just passed. Most of the kitchen crew was on break. Mr. Lawson was in the office doing invoices. A lone customer sat at the corner booth, a woman in her late 40s, poised elegant but unassuming. She was reading a dog-eared book and sipping black coffee. Her name, Tobias would later learn, was Brenda Ellis, though at the time she was just another diner. He saw her glance up at the chalkboard specials and frown. Without asking anyone, Tobias moved. He walked to the grill, cracked 3 eggs into a skillet, added a knob of brown butter, and reached for the smoked sweet corn hash he'd made the night before, but never served. He plated it quietly, sprinkled it with scallion oil, then asked the server to take it to her on the house. Brenda took a single bite, then froze. She called the server over. "Who made this new guy?" "Tobias." Brenda smiled to herself, then nodded. "Tell him thank you." She left without another word. Tobias never even saw her go. That night he dared to hope. Maybe someone had seen something in him. Maybe the tide was turning. But hope, as always, came with a price. 2 days later, Mr. Lawson called everyone in for a meeting. The mood was heavy before he even opened his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "We're shutting down. I can't keep the lights on anymore." Tobias didn't say a word. He just stood still while the floor beneath him gave way once more. By dusk, he was back in the Corolla, hugging his backpack like it held more than a knife and spare socks. He'd thought this job was the beginning of something new. Instead, it felt like the last nail in the coffin. He spent the next night parked behind a gas station, listening to the buzz of insects and distant sirens. That was when the idea hit, not like a revelation, but a whisper. If no one will give you a kitchen, build your own. The next morning, he made a list. He found an old food truck chassis listed online for $800, barely ran windows, cracked interior, filthy. He bought it with everything he had. No logo, no plan, just faith in a name. He painted it in borrowed red and gold, stenciled 2 simple words across the side: Urban Flame. No investors, no press, no guarantees. Only a young man, a busted truck, and a skillet full of dreams. He didn't have a plan. Not a real one, anyway. No business degree, no startup capital, no investor waiting on the sidelines with a checkbook. Just a half-dead food truck with rusted axles, a single burner that sometimes refused to light, and a stubborn name painted across the side in shaky gold: Urban Flame. But what Tobias Grant did have, what couldn't be bought or borrowed, was clarity. Not the kind that comes from success, but the kind that comes when you've already lost everything once and you know exactly what you're fighting for the second time around. He parked the truck at the edge of a farmer's market on Edgewood Avenue, where tourists came for craft honey and homemade soaps, but rarely for anything that smelled like butter and cayenne. His first menu was modest blackened shrimp tacos with citrus slaw, sweet corn hush puppies, and the dish he trusted more than any other southern: truffle eggs on smoked hash, the very one Brenda Ellis had once tasted in silence. No staff, no sous chef, no marketing team. Tobias handled it all. He painted signs by hand, walked the sidewalks handing out flyers, built a website on borrowed Wi-Fi from the library, and after watching 100 tutorials online, started recording cooking videos on an old iPhone duct taped to a broomstick. Urban Flame After Dark was the name of the series. Just Tobias, a hot plate, and a folding chair lit by the glow of a single bulb. He didn't edit much, didn't add music or effects. But the way he talked about food, how he described the crackle of oil, the story of his mother's cornbread, the quiet joy of feeding someone who expected nothing, it struck something rare, raw, honest. Still, that first week, the food truck was more ghost than destination. Maybe a couple of curious onlookers stopped by, mostly asking for directions or to borrow a napkin. Tobias gave away more food than he sold, especially to the folks huddled under the overpass across the street. He didn't see it as charity. He saw it as cooking with purpose. "Hot plate of joy," he'd say, handing out foil-wrapped meals with a nod. "Tell me if I use too much time." On the 5th night, the video of his southern truffle eggs, rich runny yolks over hash browned with duck fat, was picked up by a small Atlanta food blogger. A few hundred likes. A few shares, nothing viral, but just enough to put it in the algorithm's bloodstream. And that's how it landed in front of Brenda Ellis. She was scrolling late absent-mindedly until she saw the thumbnail, a young man in a hoodie cracking eggs with a quiet reverence. His voice low and certain, talking not about technique, but about memory. When I couldn't afford heat, this dish warmed more than my stomach. Brenda stared at the screen. Then, without telling anyone, she put on her coat and drove to Edgewood. Tobias didn't recognize her when she walked up. She wore jeans and a scarf hair tucked beneath a cap. She pointed at the menu board. "Truffle eggs, please." He nodded, hands moving like a quiet dance. He plated the dish, placed it gently on a paper tray, and slid it across the window. She took one bite, paused, then smiled, not politely, but fully, like someone who'd just tasted a memory of their own. "How long you been out here?" she asked. "Couple weeks," Tobias said, wiping his hands. "I'll stay till they run me off." She looked him square in the eye. "If I put that dish on national television, would you stand behind it?" He blinked. "You mean like a show?" She grinned. "Something like that. I'll call you tomorrow." He didn't believe her. Not really. He'd met too many people with promises but no follow-through. But the next morning her assistant called. A week later, Tobias was flown to Los Angeles, where the lights were blinding and the kitchen spotless. He stood backstage at American Culinary Showdown, wearing a fresh black apron and the same knife he'd carried since his church kitchen days. No script, no second takes. Just him, a burner, and a nation watching. The moment the clock started ticking, Tobias closed his eyes for half a second, heard the faint hum of a Georgia summer night, and then got to work. He wasn't just cooking to win. He was cooking to be seen. Fame doesn't arrive like a sunrise. It crashes uninvited and blinding. After Tobias's appearance on American Culinary Showdown, everything changed at a speed he couldn't control. One night he was flipping hash in a food truck with flickering lights. The next he was on Morning Talk, shows his name trending on Twitter and reporters calling him the soul chef of Atlanta. Offers poured in from investors, publicists, culinary magazines. For the first time in his life, people weren't just noticing Tobias, they were demanding more of him. He opened his first brick-and-mortar location of Urban Flame within 4 months. It was sleek but not sterile, warm, and worn like a well-used skillet. Tobias insisted on a counter where guests could sit and talk while he cooked, just like the kitchen back home. Reservations filled up weeks in advance. Celebrities posted his dishes on Instagram. Bloggers called him a voice for forgotten flavors. Some even whispered about Michelin stars. But with the spotlight came the shadows. Blogs began digging into his past, not the poetic version he told on air, but the unedited truth. Articles surfaced. Culinary star was expelled from Edison. Chef slept in car behind church. Lot from dropout to darling. But is he ready? The comments hit harder than he expected. Fake chef. PR stunt. Probably still can't afford real truffle. One headline read, "From homeless to hotshot." But how long can it last? Tobias tried to ignore it. Threw himself into his work. Longer hours, tighter menus, stricter plating standards. But the pressure swelled like a simmering pot. He stopped sleeping, stopped answering calls. The joy of cooking, the soul of who he was, began to feel like a performance choreographed for cameras and critics. Behind closed doors, he questioned everything. Was he a chef or just a story people wanted to consume? One night, after a grueling day of interviews and 2 botched deliveries, Tobias returned to his office at the back of the restaurant. He collapsed into the creaky leather chair, face in his hands. The walls felt too close, the air too thin. He was seconds from pulling off his apron and walking out for good when his sous chef knocked gently and handed him a plain white envelope. No return address, no stamps, just his name scrawled in pencil. Inside was a letter in shaky handwriting. "Dear Chef Tobias, my name is Malik. I'm 10. I saw you on TV when you made eggs. My mom said you used to be poor too. I get made fun of at school because we live in a shelter and I don't have lunch money. But I told them I don't care because I'm gonna be like you one day. I want to cook things that make people happy. I think you're the coolest chef ever. Please don't stop. Your biggest fan, Malik J. Tobias, didn't move for a long time. Then his shoulders shook. Not with anger, not with exhaustion, but with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. He cried. For the first time since the fame, since the trucks, since the night Brenda Ellis walked up to his window, Tobias Grant let go. Because in Malik's words, he saw himself not the TV version, but the boy with dirt on his jeans and hope stitched into every dream. The next morning, he walked back into the showdown kitchen for the semifinals. His competitors were younger, better funded, classically trained. But Tobias wasn't there for the judges anymore. He was there for every kid who thought their story disqualified them from greatness. When the challenge was announced, create a dish that defines your culinary identity, he didn't hesitate. He made the eggs, southern truffle eggs over smoked hash finished with scallion oil and a whisper of lemon zest. Simple, humble, and perfect. When the buzzer rang and the plates were served, the room went silent after the first bite. One of the judges set down his fork, shook his head, and murmured, "That's not a dish. That's a memory." Tobias won, not just the round, but something deeper. The second Urban Flame opened 3 months later, then a third, then a fourth. Each one with the same open counter, the same handwritten menu board, the same late-night playlist humming Otis Redding. He hired staff from shelters and halfway houses, taught free weekend classes for inner-city teens. A scholarship fund was started in Mr. Lawson's name for students who didn't fit the culinary mold. And every time he sharpened his knife, Tobias thought of that day in the back of the diner kitchen. The day Lawson handed him an apron and said, "Don't screw around in my kitchen." He didn't. He honored it. Because long before the cameras, before the hashtags, before Malik's letter, someone had seen something in him. And Tobias Grant had never forgotten what it meant to be given a chance. Fame had given Tobias Grant many things: acclaim, money, pressure, expectation. But what it hadn't given, what he thought he no longer needed, was closure. That was until the day fate brought him face to face with the woman who had once ended his dream before it ever truly began. The studio lights were blinding, cameras swiveled on cranes, catching every twitch of a hand, every glint of emotion in a chef's eye. Tobias stood among the final four contestants on American Culinary Showdown, Redemption Series, a special edition where rising chefs were pitted against legendary judges in live duels. For the first time, each chef had to cook a personal signature dish, not for approval, but for respect. He barely noticed the host's voice announcing the panel until the last name dropped like a blade. And finally, world-renowned instructor and culinary critic, Chef Eleanor Reeves. His breath caught mid-chest. The same Eleanor Reeves who had expelled him from Edison. The same woman who once circled his dish like it was roadkill and declared it uninspired, unworthy, and lacking refinement. He hadn't seen her since that afternoon she signed the dismissal papers and told him flatly, "You don't belong in this kitchen." Tobias stood straighter. Across the stage, Reeves sat with the same stern posture, her silver hair neatly pinned, her lips pressed into a habitual disapproval. She didn't flinch when her eyes swept over him. No hint of recognition. To her, he was just another contestant. But not for long. The dish he prepared was already waiting in his soul. He hadn't changed it in years. Southern truffle eggs over smoked hash, the one that had carried him through cold nights, and empty fridges, the one that had fed strangers under bridges, and been served on paper trays with trembling hands. It wasn't trendy. It wasn't avant-garde. It was him. As he cooked, his fingers moved with reverence. Every motion was deliberate, like a prayer whispered through oil and fire. The yolks shimmered delicate and defiant. The hash hissed and crackled beneath the butter. When the final sprinkle of scallion oil landed, he didn't look at the clock. He looked at her. She was reading her notes. The plates were served, one for each judge. Tobias watched, not breathing, as Reeves lifted her fork. She took one bite, then paused. Her brow creased, not in criticism, but memory. Slowly, she set the fork down, leaned back in her chair, and whispered almost to herself, "This dish, I've tasted it before. Years ago." I said it wasn't refined enough. The silence on set was heavy. Tobias took one step forward, voice steady. "You did, but I kept making it anyway. It didn't need to be refined. It needed to be real. It fed me when nothing else did. Now it feeds thousands." Eleanor Reeves looked at him, really looked this time. Her eyes searched his face, time slowly catching up. Recognition bloomed, reluctant and tinged with disbelief. "You're the boy from Edison," she murmured. "I was," Tobias replied. Now I'm the man behind Urban Flame. The other judges remained silent. It was her moment to respond. Reeves lowered her gaze to the plate once more. Then, for the first time Tobias had ever seen, she nodded deeply with both hands on the table and said, "I was wrong. You are a chef in every way that matters." The next morning, clips of the exchange flooded social media. From Dropout to Master Chef faces his past. Live on air, Tobias Grant gets his moment. Millions watched the scene, many in tears. In an era obsessed with second chances, he had become a symbol not of revenge, but redemption. Urban Flame's reservations exploded, but Tobias didn't cash in on the moment. Instead, he made a call. That fall, Urban Flame partnered with 3 vocational schools in underserved areas across the South. Tobias visited classrooms, spoke to students who had never seen a chef that looked like them, let alone heard one speak openly about being expelled or sleeping in cars. Soon after, he announced the creation of the Flame Forward Scholarship, dedicated to students who had been dismissed, rejected, or told they'd never make it. The application didn't require grades or references, just a story, a recipe, and a reason why they wouldn't quit. At the ribbon cutting for the first Flame Forward class, Tobias stood in front of a crowd of wide-eyed teens, holding a framed photo of Mr. Lawson in one hand and his old knife in the other. "You don't need someone to open the door for you," he said. "You just need someone who believes you deserve to walk through it." And in that moment, the boy who once walked away from culinary school with nothing became the man building a path for hundreds more. The lights were softer than he expected, less blinding than those in the television studios, less sharp than the gleam of a kitchen's stainless steel. They bathed the stage in a warm amber glow, like the first rays of morning sun hitting a stovetop just before the rush. Tobias stood beneath them, a crisp black suit replacing his usual apron, a small gold pin of a flame on his lapel. In his hands was the heavy polished plaque that read, "Chef of the Year, National Culinary Guild." The applause had been long thunderous, filled with the kind of admiration that only comes when the world finally catches up to a journey it once ignored. But now the room was quiet, waiting. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat once, then paused, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to feel the moment, to let it land, to let it matter. "I used to sleep in the back seat of a Corolla." He began, his voice steady, not rehearsed. "In the summer, the windows fogged up from the heat. In the winter, my breath hung in the air like steam rising from a pot. And every night as I curled beneath a coat that didn't zip anymore, I'd close my eyes and imagine the smell of butter hitting a hot skillet. Eggs. That was the dream." A murmur moved through the audience, not of surprise but reverence. "I didn't have much," Tobias continued, "but I had memory. And hunger. Not just the kind that gnaws at your stomach, but the kind that keeps you moving when everyone else says stop." He glanced down at the award in his hand, then back up his eyes, scanning the sea of chefs, students, restaurateurs, and food lovers who had gathered to celebrate excellence. "I know this is a moment to talk about what I've achieved, the restaurants, the show, the scholarship fund, but I want to use it to talk about someone else." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small faded photo, a man with rolled-up sleeves, broad shoulders, and a smudge of grease on his apron. "This is Mr. Lawson," Tobias said. "The man who gave me my first job when I had no credentials, no reputation, and no plan. He didn't ask for my resume. He didn't ask what school I came from. He just looked me in the eye and said, 'Do you love the pan?'" He smiled quietly. That one question changed everything. The room held its breath. "I stand here not because I'm the best, but because someone once upon a time believed I could be more than what the world saw. And that belief, like a flame, has never gone out." He stepped back as applause rippled again, this time, slower, deeper, touched with something more than respect. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. Because his story, as personal as it was, didn't belong to him alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough and dared to believe otherwise. The scene faded to black, then opened again, not on a gala stage or a gourmet kitchen, but outside a modest red brick building in South Atlanta. The sign above the door read, "Urban Flame Culinary Youth Program." Kids lined up outside, backpacks slung low, some in torn sneakers, others in mismatched coats. But their faces glowed. Not because they were certain of what they'd become, but because for once someone had made space for them to try. Inside aprons were too big, and knives were still blunt for safety, but the excitement was sharp electric. At the front of the room, Tobias crouched beside a boy with wild curls and a freckled nose. "What you making, chef?" Tobias asked. "Eggs," the boy said proudly. "With my own twist," Tobias laughed. "Oh yeah, you trying to outdo me?" The boy grinned wide. "I'm gonna make the best eggs ever. Better than yours." Tobias placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, heart full. "I hope you do," he whispered. As the camera pulled back, catching the bustle of learning the messy beauty of ambition, Tobias's voice lingered over the scene. "Not everyone is born with fire, but if someone lights the match for you, don't let it go out." The screen faded to black, but the warmth lingered. And then, like a final note in a song you didn't want to end, his voice returned soft, but certain. Rebirth is real. All it takes is cooking with your whole heart. Thanks for watching. If Tobias's story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Comment below what inspired you most. See you in the next story.